turned into a disaster. When guests started getting sick, and the only person acting strangely was my stepsister smiling in the corner. It was supposed to be a simple celebration. Nothing extravagant, nothing, just a backyard barbecue for my 35th birthday on a mild Saturday afternoon in our suburban neighborhood outside Chicago. The kind of gathering where neighbors chat over burgers and kids chase each other with water guns. But as I stood there flipping steaks on the grill, the first wave of unease hit when my best friend Sarah clutched her stomach and excused herself to the bathroom, her face paling under the string lights we'd hung the night before. And I thought maybe it was the heat or something she ate earlier. But then, Uncle Mike, my dad's brother, doubled over by the picnic table, vomiting into the grass while apologizing profusely. And soon, it was chaos. Guests rushing inside, the sound of retching echoing from the downstairs powder room. My husband Tom dialing 911 with one hand while holding our 10-year-old daughter Lily's hair back as she heaved into a bush, her little face twisted in confusion and pain, asking me why her tummy hurt so bad. And all I could do was rub her back and whisper that it would be okay, even as panic clawed at my throat, because this wasn't normal. This wasn't food poisoning from bad mayo or undercooked meat. I'd been meticulous, checking temperatures, using fresh ingredients from the farmer's market that morning. And as paramedics arrived, sirens cutting through the chatter, loading people onto stretchers, I scanned the yard for answers, my heart pounding like it might burst. And that's when I saw her. My stepsister, Emily, standing in the far corner by the fence, not helping, not panicking like everyone else, but smiling, a small, satisfied curve to her lips as she sipped her untouched lemonade, her eyes meeting mine for a split second before she looked away, pretending to scroll on her phone. And something inside me fractured. A cold realization seeping in that this wasn't an accident, that the only person who'd insisted on helping with the food prep, who'd hovered in the kitchen all morning while I was distracted with decorations, was her. And why was she smiling like that? Like she'd won some secret game while my world crumbled. I pushed through the crowd, my legs shaky, ignoring Tom's call, to stay put as the ambulances pulled away with half our guests, including Lily, who was crying for me, her small hand reaching out, but I couldn't stop. Not when Emily turned to me with that feigned innocence, her voice light as she asked what was wrong. As if she hadn't seen the vomit-streaked lawn or heard the groans, and I grabbed her arm harder than I meant to, whispering through gritted teeth, "What did you do?" And she just blinked, pulling back with a hurt expression that didn't reach her eyes, saying she had no idea what I was talking about. But I knew, deep in my gut, the way you know when someone's been poisoning your life in subtle ways for years, for years. Ever since our parents married when we were teens and she moved in, always the perfect daughter too. My dad's new wife, always undermining me with little comments about my choices, my marriage, my parenting, like the time she accidentally spilled wine on my wedding dress the night before the ceremony, or suggested to Lily that I was too busy with work to care about her school plays. And now this, on my birthday, turning a day of joy into a nightmare. Guests whispering about lawsuits or allergies as they staggered to their cars, the paramedics mentioning possible contamination, advising everyone to get checked at the ER, and as the yard emptied, leaving behind overturned chairs and half-eaten plates, I confronted her fully in the kitchen. The air thick with the smell of abandoned food, demanding to know why she'd do something so vicious, so dangerous. And she denied it at first, tears welling up convincingly, but then her mask slipped, just a fraction. When she muttered that maybe I deserved a little chaos, for always being the golden child, for taking everything for granted, her voice laced with years of resentment I hadn't fully acknowledged. The kind that simmers in blended families where love is unevenly distributed, where my dad favored me after mom died, leaving Emily on the outside, looking in. And as Tom came in, his face ashen from driving Lily to the hospital, overhearing the accusation, he stared at Emily like she'd grown horns, asking if it was true, if she'd tampered with the food, maybe the salad dressing, or the dips. Something everyone but her had touched, and she broke then, not fully admitting but deflecting with sobs about how hard it was living in my shadow, how she'd only meant to make a few people queasy, not this bad, not hospital bad, and the raw pain hit me like a tidal wave, betrayal slicing through the shock, because this was family, or supposed to be, the stepsister I tried to bond with over coffee date, since shared holidays. Ignoring the barbs, because that's what you do in modern families. You therapy your way through it. Talk about boundaries on podcasts while scrolling Instagram. But now, with the house silent except for her crying, and Tom's stunned silence, I felt the immediate fallout. The trust shattered, like the glass I'd dropped earlier. Shards everywhere. Shards everywhere. And I told her to leave, my voice breaking, that she wasn't welcome here anymore, not after endangering my child, my friends, my life. And as she gathered her things, my life, and as she gathered her things, still protesting innocence, mixed with excuses about her own pain, her failed relationships, her job loss last year, that I'd helped her through. I wondered how we'd gotten here, how resentment could fester into something so toxic, literally. And as the door closed behind her, I sank to the floor, knees to my chest, the weight of it all pressing down, guilt creeping in for not seeing it sooner, for inviting her into the kitchen that morning with a hug, thinking we were finally okay, but we weren't. And now my birthday was marked not by cake and laughter, but by ambulances and accusations, the start of a rift that might never heal. Leaving me alone in the dimming light, phone buzzing with concerned texts from the hospital, Tom rushing back out to check on Lily, and me hollowed out, staring at the corner where she'd smiled, wondering if family could ever recover from poison like this. That first full night after the party stretched into something unrecognizable, the house settling into an unnatural quiet broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional distant siren reminding me of the ambulances that had carried away pieces of my life hours earlier. And I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the rumpled comforter where Tom had thrown his keys earlier, before rushing back to the hospital to stay with Lily, who was still hooked to an IV for fluids because the doctors wanted to monitor her overnight, even though the worst of the vomiting had passed. Her small voice on the phone earlier, cracking, when she asked if I was coming soon, if the bad food was gone now, and I'd lied smoothly, said yes, baby mommy, just cleaning up. I'll be there first thing, because how do you explain to a 10-year-old that the person who gave her extra marshmallows on her Samhors last Christmas might have deliberately made her sick? Tom had come home briefly around 9 to grab a change of clothes, his face drawn and gray under the hallway light, and when our eyes met in the kitchen, he didn't speak at first. Just stood there holding the fridge door open, like he'd forgotten why he opened it. Then finally asked in a low voice if I really believed Emily had done it on purpose. I really believed Emily had done it on purpose. If this wasn't some horrible misunderstanding or mass hysteria from bad shrimp we both missed, and I told him about the smile. That tiny, private curve of her mouth in the corner while everyone else was suffering. How she hadn't touched a single bite of the food she'd helped prepare. How she'd lingered near the potato salad longer than necessary when no one was watching. And he listened without interrupting, his shoulders slumping further with each detail until he closed the fridge door too hard. The bottles inside rattling, and said he didn't know what to feel. Rage at her. Guilt for ever trusting her around our daughter. Sorrow for the family we tried to stitch together over the years. And then he asked the question that lodged in my throat like a stone. Whether I thought this was the first time she'd crossed a line, or just the first time we'd caught her. And I couldn't answer, because the possibilities unspooled in my mind like dark threads. The mysterious stomach bugs Lily had last spring, after Emily babysat, the expired milk she poured for my coffee once when she visited, always explained away as accidents or oversights. And now I wondered how many small sabotages I'd dismissed as her being clumsy or jealous instead of calculated. And the realization made my skin crawl, made me want to scrub every surface she'd touched in this house. He left again after that, kissing my forehead mechanically before he went, promising to text updates, and I stayed behind because someone had to deal with the aftermath. The half-eaten platters still on the counters. Still on the counters. The sticky lemonade rings on the coffee table. The faint sour smell of vomit, lingering in the hallway even after I'd mopped twice. And as I worked methodically, scraping plates into the trash, running the dishwasher on heavy cycle, wiping down every handle and switch, my mind kept circling back to Emily's confession in fragments. How she'd sobbed, that she only wanted me to feel off balance for once, to see what it was like when things didn't go perfectly. How she'd laced the ranch dip with something from the cleaning cabinet under the sink. Not enough to kill anyone. She swore, just enough to ruin the day. And the casual way she'd said it, like spiking food was a petty prank instead of felony assault, left me shaking so hard I had to sit on the kitchen floor for a minute, head between my knees, breathing through the nausea that wasn't from any poison but from the sheer betrayal of it all. Around midnight, Tom texted that Lily was sleeping, that the doctors thought she'd be discharged in the morning with no lasting damage, and I replied with a string of heart emojis because words felt inadequate. Then I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of her room, looking at the empty bed with its unicorn sheets, the stuffed giraffe she still slept with at 10, and the guilt hit fresh. Why hadn't I protected her better? Why had I let Emily near her so often just to keep the peace with Dad and his wife? Why had I thought forcing family closeness would ever work when the resentment ran this deep? I ended up on the couch downstairs because the bed felt too big without Tom, too full of memories of quieter nights when we'd scroll phones side by side, laughing at memes or planning weekend trips. And now every creak of the house made me tense, imagining Emily somehow still here, lurking, though I changed the locks after she left, an impulse that felt both dramatic and necessary. Sleep came in shallow bursts, interrupted by dreams, where I was back at the grill, flipping burgers that turned to ash, guests collapsing, one by one, while Emily watched from the shadows, her smile growing wider, each time someone fell. And I woke sweating, heart racing, reaching instinctively for my phone to check the time. 3:47 a.m., and saw a new text from my dad, sent at 2:12, just, we need to talk about Emily. Call me when you can. No apology, no concern for Lily, just that terse demand, And something in me hardened further, because even now, after everything, he was protecting her first, the way he always had. And I didn't reply, just turned the phone, face down, and pulled the throw blanket tighter, listening to the rain start tapping against the windows, a soft, steady rhythm that matched the slow, heavy beat of my thoughts circling the same questions. How do you rebuild trust when someone you called family tried to hurt the people you love most? How do you look at your stepsister again without seeing that smile in the corner? How do you explain any of this to Lily when she asks why Aunt Em isn't coming to movie night anymore? By dawn, the rain had eased to a drizzle gray light filtering through the blinds, and I made coffee the way I always did. Strong, black, no sugar. Except this time, my hand shook, pouring it, splashing on the counter. And as I wiped it up, I caught my reflection in the dark window, hollow-eyed and unfamiliar, already changed by one afternoon and one night of truth, knowing the real unraveling was only beginning. That the confession Tom and I had forced out of Emily in the kitchen was just the surface crack, and beneath it lay years of buried hurt waiting to surface, ready to pull us all under if we weren't careful. The morning after that endless first night brought no relief, only the dull, gray light of another overcast day filtering through the kitchen blinds as I stood at the counter stirring oatmeal I had no intention of eating, the spoon moving in slow circles, while my phone buzzed again with another concerned text from Sarah, who had been released from the ER around dawn and was now home resting, but still asking if Lily was okay, if Lily was okay, if we knew what had happened, and I typed back a vague getting better, thanks for checking, because the truth felt too heavy to type out, too final, like admitting it would make the betrayal realer than it already was. Tom had texted at 6 that they were discharging Lily soon, that she'd slept fitfully, but was asking for pancakes instead of hospital jello. And when I read those words, something cracked open inside me again. A fresh wave of protectiveness, mixed with terror because how do you let your child back into a world where someone she called aunt had poisoned her birthday cake, slice along with everyone else's? I drove to the hospital in silence, no radio, just the slap of wipers against the windshield and the low rumble of tires on wet pavement, rehearsing in my head what I'd say to Lily when she asked about Emily, because she would ask. She always noticed absences, the way kids do, like missing puzzle pieces. And I still hadn't figured out an age-appropriate version of your aunt tried to make everyone sick because she's angry at me, and I didn't see it coming. When I arrived, Tom was in the hallway holding 2 paper cups of terrible coffee, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, and he handed me one without a word, our fingers brushing in that small, exhausted contact that felt like the only tether left between us. Then he nodded toward the room where Lily sat up in bed, coloring on the tray table, her hospital gown too big, her hair still tangled from yesterday, and the sight of her small shoulders hunched over a picture of a rainbow made my throat close up because she looked so ordinary, so untouched by the ugliness that had caused this. And yet here we were. She lit up when she saw me, calling Mommy, in that bright voice that hadn't been dimmed by the IV or the nausea, and I went to her, burying my face in her hair that still smelled faintly of hospital antiseptic, whispering sorry over and over, even though she didn't know what for. And she patted my back like she was the grown-up, saying it wasn't my fault. The food made her sick. Maybe next time we should just order pizza. Tom watched from the doorway, his jaw tight, and when the nurse came in with discharge papers, he stepped out to handle them, giving me a moment alone with Lily. And I sat on the edge of the bed, holding her hand, tracing the little veins on the back of it, and finally asked if she remembered seeing Aunt Emily yesterday, if she'd noticed anything funny. And she thought for a second. Crayon paused mid-stroke. Then said Aunt Em gave her extra sprinkles on her cupcake, but told her not to tell me because it was our secret, and the casual way she said it, like it was just another fun game, sent ice through my veins, because I realized Emily had been planting these little secrets for who knows how long, building a private world with my daughter that excluded me. And the violation of that, of using Lily as a pawn, in whatever grudge she nursed, made the anger flare, hot and sharp again. But I swallowed it down, kissed Lily's forehead, and said we'd talk more at home. That Aunt Em was going through some grown-up stuff, and might need space for a while. On the drive back, Lily chattered about school, and the new girl in her class, while Tom and I exchanged glances, in the rearview mirror, silent agreements passing between us. No more unsupervised time with Emily. No more dropping by unannounced. No more pretending the blended family holidays were anything but strained performances. When we got home, the house felt different, smaller somehow. The air still carrying traces of yesterday's disaster, despite the windows I'd opened to air it out. And after settling Lily on the couch with a blanket and her favorite show, Tom and I stood in the kitchen, backs against opposite counters, like we were afraid to get too close. And he asked what we were going to tell my dad and stepmom because they'd already called twice, wanting to check on everyone, but mostly, I suspected, wanting to defend Emily before the accusation stuck. I told him I wasn't ready to talk to them yet, that the priority was Lily, keeping her steady, making sure she felt safe in her own home, and he nodded, rubbing his face with both hands. Then said he'd already spoken to his sister, the one who lived across town, and she'd offered to take Lily for the afternoon so we could have some space to figure things out. And the idea of handing her off, even to trusted family, made my stomach twist, but I agreed because I needed to breathe, needed to think, without her small ears, nearby, picking up fragments of adult pain. When my sister in law arrived an hour later, all cheerful efficiency with snacks and a plan for mini golf, Lily hugged me tight and whispered that she hoped I felt better soon. Thinking my quietness was because I had eaten the bad food too, and watching her leave in that minivan, waving from the back seat, left me standing in the driveway longer than necessary, rain starting again in a fine mist. Until Tom came out and put his arm around my shoulders, not saying anything, just holding me there while water soaked through our shirts. Back inside, we sat at the dining table, the same one where we'd planned the party menu 2 weeks ago, and I pulled out my phone, scrolling to Emily's contact, hesitating over the block button because blocking felt childish and final, but not blocking felt like leaving the door open for more harm. And Tom watched me, then gently took the phone, set it face down, and said we should set clear rules first, before any more conversations, before therapy or apologies or whatever came next, starting with no contact unless it went through him or a neutral third party, no showing up at Lily's school events, no texts or calls to our daughter, and I nodded, the practicality of boundaries grounding me a little, reminding me that protection wasn't just emotional but logistical too. We spent the next hour writing them down on a legal pad. Things like all future family gatherings require mutual agreement and supervision, no gifts or food from Emily, without inspection, complete transparency about any contact attempts. And as we wrote, the words felt both absurd and necessary, like drafting a treaty after a war nobody saw coming. And when we finished, I texted my dad a short message. Lily's home and recovering. We need space right now. Emily crossed a serious line yesterday. Details later. Please don't bring her here. His reply came almost immediately. Just understood. Call when ready. No questions. No defense. And that silence hurt. Almost as much as if he'd argued, because it confirmed what I'd feared for years. When push came to shove, he'd choose the path of least resistance over standing up for what was right, and the ache of that, of being the one who always had to hold the boundary, settled deep in my chest as Tom and I sat there. The list between us like a fragile map forward, knowing the real talks with Emily and our parents were still ahead. That protecting Lily meant shielding her not just from poison, but from the slow erosion of trust that had been happening in this family long before yesterday's disaster. And for the first time, I let myself feel the exhaustion of carrying it all. The weight of being the one who noticed, who named it, who now had to decide how much wreckage we could salvage without breaking everything else. By Monday, the rain had stopped, but the sky stayed low and heavy, the kind of weather that makes every room feel smaller. And after dropping Lily at school with a quick hug and a promise to pick her up myself, no more carpool this week, I drove straight to my sister-in-law's house instead of work, calling in sick for the second day because pretending to focus on spreadsheets felt impossible when my mind kept replaying Emily's smile, the way her lips had curved while Lily retched in the bushes. And I needed air that wasn't tainted by the house we'd all been in together just 48 hours ago. Claire met me at the door with a travel mug of tea already poured, no questions, just a quiet, come in before the neighbors start wondering, and we ended up on her back porch, wrapped in throw blankets, even though it wasn't that cold. The steam rising between us as I finally let the story spill out in full. Not the sanitized version I'd given Tom or my dad, but the raw details. How Emily had volunteered to chop the vegetables Saturday morning. How she disappeared into the pantry for too long. How I'd laughed it off when she came back smelling faintly of bleach because she said she'd cleaned a spill. How that same smell had lingered on the cutting board I used for the salad. And Claire listened without interrupting, her face growing tighter with each sentence until she set her mug down hard enough to slosh tea over the rim and said, "You need to get out of that house for a bit. Pack a bag. Take the weekend. Take the weekend. Let Tom hold down the fort." The suggestion landed like permission I hadn't known I was waiting for. And by lunchtime, I was booking a cheap Airbnb an hour north. A small cabin on a lake I used to visit as a kid before my mom died, before blended families and forced Thanksgivings. And when I told Tom over the phone, he didn't argue, just asked if I wanted him to come too or stay with Lily. And I said, "Stay, please. Keep her routine normal. Keep the world from tilting more than it already had." And he agreed, his voice thick with the same exhaustion I felt, promising to text photos of her homework and dinner and bedtime stories so I wouldn't miss the small anchors of our days. I left that afternoon after hugging Lily extra long at pickup, telling her I had a work thing, but I'd call every night and bring her a smooth lake stone if she was good for Daddy. And she nodded solemnly, already sensing the shift in the air around us. The way adults get quiet and careful when something big is broken. The drive up was quiet, except for the low murmur of a podcast I barely heard. My thoughts drifting to the rules we'd written on that legal pad, boundaries that felt both too rigid and not rigid enough. And I wondered if space would clarify anything or just give the hurt more room to spread. The cabin was exactly as I remembered from childhood photos: cedar siding, a narrow deck overlooking water that looked black under the clouds, a wood stove I hadn't lit in years, and when I stepped inside, the smell of pine and old books hit me like a memory I could lean into. And for the first time since the party, I allowed myself to cry properly. Not the choked sobs of Friday night, but deep, ugly weeping that left my ribs sore. Because here, with no one watching, I could finally admit how scared I was. Not just of what Emily had done, but of what it revealed about all of us. My dad's selective blindness, my stepmom's quiet enabling, Tom's initial hesitation to believe it, my own habit of smoothing edges so no one had to feel uncomfortable. I spent the first evening sitting on the deck in an Adirondack chair, phone in my lap, scrolling through old photos. Lily's first day of kindergarten, with Emily in the background, holding balloons. Christmas mornings where we all smiled too wide for the camera, and each image stung differently now, the smiles looking forced, the closeness staged. And when Claire texted asking how I was, I replied honestly, hurting, but breathing. Thanks for pushing me to come here. She sent back a single heart emoji, and a photo of her own porch light glowing against the dusk, a small reminder that I wasn't entirely alone. The next morning, I walked the lake trail in mist, so thick I could barely see, 10 feet ahead, boots sinking into soft earth, and let my mind wander to the practical decisions I'd been avoiding. Should I press charges? I'd been avoiding. Should I press charges? Was it worth the legal mess when the hospital had already ruled it intentional contamination? But no one had died. Did I want Emily prosecuted? Or just gone from our lives? And the answers shifted with every step. Sometimes yes to justice, sometimes no, because court would drag Lily into depositions and headlines, sometimes just wanting to erase her number and never speak again. By afternoon, I was on the phone with a friend from college who had gone through her own family implosion years ago, and she listened while I paced the small living room. Then gently asked what transparency would look like going forward, if I ever considered letting Emily near us again. And I laughed bitterly because the idea felt impossible. But she pressed. Passwords to phones if needed. Open location sharing, supervised visits only. Maybe even written apologies vetted by a therapist first. And as she spoke, I wrote notes on the back of a grocery receipt. Rules that felt clinical but also like armor. And realized I was already thinking in terms of if, not never. Which surprised me because part of me still wanted to burn every bridge. Yet another part, the tired, hopeful part that still believed in second chances after enough work, wasn't ready to close the door completely. That night, I built a fire in the stove, the crackle filling the silence, and called Tom. Lily got on first, telling me about the frog she'd found in the backyard and how Daddy let her keep it in a jar overnight. And her ordinary excitement cracked something open in me again, a reminder that she was still whole, despite everything, still capable of wonder. And when Tom took the phone, he asked how I was really doing, no filter. And I told him about the rules I'd started listing, about needing more than space, needing proof that Emily understood the gravity, that she'd get help, that we'd have safeguards. And he was quiet for a long moment, then said he'd have been thinking the same, that he'd already looked up family therapists who specialized in blended family trauma and sent me 3 names. And the simple act of him doing that without being asked felt like the first real step toward us, facing this together instead of orbiting separate hurts. I slept better that night, the lake lapping softly outside, the fire dying to embers, and woke to sunlight breaking through the clouds for the first time in days, weak but persistent. And as I packed to head home Sunday afternoon, I felt the shift. Not forgiveness, not yet. Not even close, but a decision to try defining the terms instead of letting the betrayal define us, to build walls where needed and doors where possible, to protect what mattered most while leaving room for the slow, leaving room for the slow. Uncertain work of repair if it ever became safe again, and driving back down the highway with the window cracked, cool air rushing in, I let myself imagine a future where Lily didn't have to choose sides, where Tom and I could hold hands without the ghost of that smile hovering, where family wasn't perfect, but wasn't poisoned either, just scarred, cautious, and still breathing. The first week back felt like walking on new ice, thin in places, cracking under every careful step. And by Wednesday, I'd already canceled 2 therapy appointments because the thought of sitting in a stranger's office saying the words out loud made my skin feel too tight. But Thursday morning, after dropping Lily at school, I sat in the car outside her building for 10 minutes staring at the steering wheel, rain pattering again like it had every day since the party, and finally dialed the number Tom had sent me from the cabin weekend. The one for Dr. Elena Marquez, a woman whose website photo showed calm, dark eyes and no fake smile. And when she answered her own line, I almost hung up, but instead heard myself asking for the soonest slot, and she had a cancellation that afternoon, which felt like fate or just luck. I couldn't decide. A luck, but I took it because the alternative was another night, lying awake, cataloging every small meanness Emily had slipped into our lives over the years. From joking comments about my weight at family dinners to suggesting Lily needed more discipline when she was just being a normal, energetic kid. The office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, soft beige walls and plants that looked like they actually got watered. And when Dr. Marquez greeted me at the door in jeans and a cardigan, she didn't shake my hand. She didn't shake my hand, just nodded toward the couch and asked if I wanted water or tea. And I chose tea because holding something warm seems safer than empty hands. Then she sat across from me in an armchair, notepad on her lap, but pen down, and waited. No rush, no clipboard checklist, just quiet space that somehow made the silence feel less like judgment and more like invitation. I started with the facts, the party, the sickness, Emily's smile, the confession in the kitchen, because those were the easiest pieces, the ones that didn't require digging into the softer, more shameful parts yet. But even reciting them left me hoarse, my tea cooling, untouched. And when I finished, she asked one gentle question. What does that smile mean to you now, when you picture it? And the answer came before I could stop it. It means she enjoyed watching us hurt, and saying it aloud cracked something open, let the tears come fast and hot, and I cried for what felt like half the hour, while she passed tissues and stayed steady, not trying to fix it, just witnessing. And by the end, I felt lighter in a way that scared me because lightness meant vulnerability, meant I might have to feel the next wave, too. That night, I told Tom about the session over takeout Thai on the couch after Lily was asleep. The living room lit only by the TV, paused on some nature documentary. And he listened while picking at Pacey. Abe was, you wasn't really eating. Then said he had booked his own individual appointment for next week because he realized he'd been carrying his own guilt. Guilt for not seeing Emily's pattern sooner, for laughing off her barbs as sibling rivalry, for ever letting her babysit alone. And hearing him name it felt like the first real bridge between us since the party, not the automatic partnership of marriage, but something chosen, deliberate, like we were both deciding to show up for the repair instead of just surviving it. The next small vulnerability came Friday when Lily asked at breakfast why Aunt Em hadn't texted her goodnight like usual. And instead of deflecting with a vague, she's busy, I took a breath, sat beside her at the table with my coffee going cold, and said, Aunt Em made a really big mistake last weekend that hurt a lot of people, including you. And right now we're taking some time apart so everyone can feel safe again. Keeping it simple, no details about poison or hospitals, just honest enough that her eyes searched mine for more, but didn't find panic, and she nodded slowly, then asked if we could still have movie night without her, and I said yes, absolutely, and the relief on her face made my chest ache, because she was already adapting, already learning how to hold disappointment without breaking, and I hated that she had to learn it, so young, but was grateful she was learning it with us beside her. Over the weekend, I started small acts alone, changing the passcode on my phone so Emily couldn't use the old one if she ever tried, deleting her from our shared family calendar app. Even going through the junk drawer and tossing the spare key she'd had for emergencies, and each one felt like reclaiming a tiny piece of ground, like saying, this space is ours, not hers to wander into anymore. Monday, I went back to Dr. Marquez, and this time I talked about the deeper current underneath the betrayal. How Emily's resentment had roots in my dad remarrying too soon after mom died. How he'd poured extra attention into me to compensate for my loss, while Emily got the leftovers. How I'd internalized that as guilt and overcompensated by being the nice stepsister, inviting her to everything, overlooking slights, thinking kindness would eventually balance the scales. And Dr. Marquez asked what it would feel like to stop carrying that guilt, to let it belong to the people who created the imbalance, and I didn't have an answer yet, but the question stayed with me. Humming quietly through the week as I moved through ordinary days, packing Lily's lunch with the cartoon notes she loved, answering work emails during nap time, if she still napped on weekends, walking the dog in the pale February light, and each routine task felt like proof we were still here, still functioning, even if the edges were raw. The first tentative contact came unexpectedly on Thursday evening when my phone lit up with a text from Emily's number, short and careful. I'm seeing someone, a counselor. I know you need space. Just wanted you to know I'm not pretending nothing happened. I'm sorry. No excuses, no deflection, just those bare sentences. And I stared at them for a long time, thumb hovering over reply. Heart thudding with a mix of anger and something softer, almost like pity. Because I could picture her sitting in her own therapist's office, saying the same words I'd said to Dr. Marquez, facing her own version of that smile in the mirror. I didn't respond that night, showed the message to Tom instead, while we washed dishes side by side, our elbows brushing, and he read it silently, then set the phone down and asked what I wanted to do. No pressure either way, and I said I wasn't sure yet, but maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something that wasn't forgiveness, but acknowledgement, a tiny crack of light where before there'd only been shadow. And as we finished the dishes in quiet rhythm, the kitchen warm with steam and lemon dish soap, I felt the first faint stir of possibility. Not that everything would snap back, not that trust would regrow overnight, but that individual steps, small and private and hard won, might eventually lead us somewhere less broken, somewhere we could stand together again, without always looking over our shoulders for the next hidden harm. The first joint session happened on a Tuesday in early March, 6 weeks after the party, the kind of gray afternoon where the streetlights come on too early and everyone's headlights look too bright against the drizzle. And Tom and I drove there separately because he had a late meeting at work, and I wanted the quiet car time to steady myself, my hands tight on the wheel as I rehearsed what I might say. Though Dr. Marquez had warned us both in our individual calls that the first couples session wasn't about fixing everything, but about learning to sit in the same room with the truth without anyone running away. I arrived first. We'll talk. Parked in the small lot behind the Victorian house and waited in the lobby, flipping through a magazine I didn't read until Tom walked in. Coat, damp, tamp, carrying 2 paper cups from the coffee shop down the block. Black for me, latte for him, and when he handed mine over, our fingers touched longer than necessary. A small, deliberate contact that felt like acknowledgement, like we were both choosing to show up even when every instinct screamed to retreat. Dr. Marquez greeted us together this time, leading us into a larger room with 2 armchairs facing her sofa, a low table between us, holding only a box of tissues and a small plant. No clock visible, so the time wouldn't press. And once we sat, she started by asking each of us, separately, what we hoped to get from being here today. No pressure to answer the other person's question yet. I went first, voice quieter than I intended, and said I wanted to understand how resentment could turn into something so dangerous without me seeing the signs. And I wanted to know if we could ever rebuild safety around Lily without constant vigilance wearing us down. And Tom listened with his elbows on his knees, nodding slowly. Then, when it was his turn, he said he hoped to stop second guessing every decision he'd made about family boundaries, to stop feeling like he'd failed to protect us by not noticing sooner, and to figure out how to support me without trying to rush me past the anger I still carried. Dr. Marquez nodded, jotting something brief, then asked if we were ready to name the deeper issues underneath the surface event. And when we both said yes, she turned to me and asked what the poisoning had tapped into that felt older than that one afternoon, and the words came haltingly at first. How I'd spent years in this blended family trying to be the peacemaker, the one who didn't rock the boat. Because after Mom died, I was terrified of losing Dad, too. So I let Emily's small cruelties slide. Her snide remarks about my perfect life, her habit of correcting my parenting in front of others, because confronting them meant risking another fracture. And somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that swallowing hurt was the price of keeping everyone together. But the party had shown me that swallowing only fed the poison until it overflowed onto everyone I loved. And I I. Tom reached over then, tentative, and rested his hand on mine on the armrest, palm up, an open invitation rather than a demand. And when I turned mine over to lace our fingers, it felt clumsy, almost formal, but real. Like we were practicing touch again after weeks of careful distance. Dr. Marquez asked him next what the event had stirred in him, and he spoke about his own family history, growing up with a father who minimized conflict until it exploded, and how he'd promised himself he'd never do that. Yet here he was, having minimized Emily's red flags for years, because he didn't want to be the difficult in-law, didn't want to make things harder for me. And the guilt of that silence had been eating at him since the ambulances pulled away. We sat with those admissions for a long minute, the room quiet, except for the soft tick of rain on the window. And then Dr. Marquez suggested we try something small, name one specific fear each of us had about moving forward, and listen without interrupting or fixing. I said I was afraid that if we let Emily back in even a little, the next betrayal would be worse, that I'd never stop scanning for hidden motives, that Lily would grow up sensing the tension and think love always came with strings. Tom said he feared I'd never fully trust him again because he hadn't trusted his own instincts sooner, that he'd become the husband who missed the danger signs, and that scared him more than anything because he'd always thought protecting us was the one thing he was good at. Hearing him say it out loud, raw and unguarded, made my throat tighten, and I squeezed his hand harder without meaning to, and for the first time since the party, I let myself feel the sadness underneath my anger, not just at Emily, but at how fear had kept all of us small how we had all been protecting different versions of family at the cost of seeing the truth. Toward the end of the hour, Dr. Marquez asked if we were willing to try one small step closer before we left, something symbolic but concrete. And after a pause, Tom suggested we sit on the same side of the room next session, no armchairs across from each other, just side by side on the sofa, and I nodded, surprised at how much the idea both unnerved and steadied me. Because proximity meant vulnerability, but also meant we weren't facing this alone anymore. When the session ended, we walked out together into the damp parking lot, neither of us rushing to our separate cars, neither of us, and stood under the overhang while the rain picked up, sharing the last of his latte, because mine had gone cold. And he said quietly that hearing me name the peacemaker role I'd played for so long made him see how much I'd been carrying alone. And I admitted that hearing his fear about failing us made me realize I'd been holding him at a slight distance too, punishing him silently for not seeing what I hadn't fully seen either. We didn't kiss or hug goodbye. That still felt too soon, too loaded. But he walked me to my car, opened the door for me, the way he used to before everything cracked. And when I looked up at him from the driver's seat, there was something new in his eyes. Not resolution exactly, but willingness. A quiet promise to keep showing up. And as I drove home through rush hour traffic, windshield wipers sweeping in steady arcs, I felt the tiniest shift inside. Not the rush of forgiveness, not the erasure of pain, but the beginning of space where something else could grow. Cautious, slow, earned because we had named the deeper wounds in the same room, held hands through the naming, and left with a plan to sit closer next time. Side by side instead of opposite, a small act that felt enormous in its simplicity. Proof that even after poison, even after silence, two people could still choose to move toward each other, one deliberate step at a time. The family weekend away happened in late April, almost 3 months after the party, when the first real warmth finally settled over the Midwest, and the trees along the highway north of the city were that bright, almost fluorescent green that makes everything look newly washed. Tom had suggested the trip during our fourth joint session with Dr. Marquez, framing it not as a fix but as a test. Could we spend 3 days together in a small rented house on a quiet lake, without the safety net of separate bedrooms or easy escapes to work or school routines? Could we share meals and walks and silences without the ghost of Emily's smile, turning every glance into suspicion? I'd hesitated for days, the idea stirring equal parts, longing and dread, because closeness still felt dangerous, like stepping onto ground that might give way. But Lily had overheard us talking about it one evening, and her face lit up at the word lake, asking if we could bring the paddleboard she had gotten for her birthday last year, and if we could make s'mores every night, and her uncomplicated excitement tipped the scale. We booked the place, a 3-bedroom cedar A-frame with a wide deck overlooking water that sparkled under the spring sun, and drove up on a Friday after school let out. Lily chattering in the back seat about the playlist she'd made on her tablet, mostly Taylor Swift and some oldies Tom loved, while we held hands across the console in the front seat, not tightly, just resting there, not tightly, a small, ongoing reminder that we were attempting this together. The first evening was tentative. Unpacking groceries we'd stopped for on the way, Lily racing to claim the top bunk in the loft, while Tom and I moved around each other in the narrow kitchen, like people learning a new dance. Careful not to brush too close, and when dinner was ready, grilled chicken and corn we'd bought from a roadside stand, I set 3 plates on the picnic table outside instead of the indoor one, because the air felt safer, fresher, less loaded with memories of backyard disasters. Lily talked through mouthfuls about the frog she'd seen by the dock, about how she wanted to name it Hopper if we caught it, and Tom and I listened, adding small questions, our voices overlapping in the easy way they used to before everything cracked. And when she finished eating, she ran off to explore the short path to the water while we cleared the table side by side, shoulders almost touching, and for the first time in months, the silence between us wasn't heavy with unspoken accusations, but simply quiet, companionable, the kind that lets you breathe. Later, after Lily was asleep upstairs with the window cracked to let in lake sounds, Tom and I sat on the deck in Adirondack chairs, a blanket shared across our laps against the evening chill, mugs of chamomile tea steaming between us, and he asked, low enough not to wake her, if being here felt okay so far, and I told him honestly that it did. Mostly, that the distance from home had shrunk the shadow Emily still cast, that watching Lily skip stones without a care made the hurt feel farther away, and he nodded, then said he'd been afraid the whole drive up that one wrong word would unravel us again. But sitting here now, he realized how much he'd missed this version of us. The one that didn't need to fill every quiet moment with explanations. I reached for his hand then, not tentative this time, but sure, and when our fingers laced, I felt the callus on his thumb from years of guitar strings he hadn't played since before Lily was born, and the familiarity of it cracked open something tender We stayed like that until the stars came out sharp above the water, talking in low voices about small things first. Lily's upcoming science fair project, but the leak in the garage roof we still hadn't fixed. Then, gradually deeper, how he'd started journaling after his individual sessions, writing down moments when old patterns of minimization crept in, so he could catch them earlier, how I'd begun a separate list of things I refused to apologize for anymore, like setting firm boundaries or prioritizing Lily's safety over forced family harmony. The next morning, we took the paddleboard out together, all three of us, Lily in front, giggling every time the board wobbled, Tom steady at the back, calling out paddle instructions like a coach. Me in the middle, holding the middle ground, literally and figuratively. And when we tipped once, cold water, shocking us all, Lily's shriek turned to laughter, so pure it echoed across the lake. And Tom and I surfaced, sputtering, looking at each other with wet hair plastered to our foreheads, and something unspoken passed between us. This was what we were fighting to keep. These moments where joy could still break through the scar tissue. That afternoon, we hiked a short trail to a lookout, Lily running ahead to collect pine cones while Tom and I walked slower, hands brushing occasionally, and at the top, we sat on a fallen log while she built a tiny cairn. And he turned to me, voice rough, and said he was sorry, not just for missing the signs with Emily, but for every time he'd let keeping the peace mean letting me carry the emotional load alone. And I told him I was sorry too. For shutting down instead of letting him in when the anger felt safest, for making him feel like an outsider in his own family's pain. And when the words were out, we didn't rush to fill the space after. We just sat, sated, watching Lily balance stones, the wind moving through new leaves, and when she ran back to show us her tower, we both pulled her between us in a hug that lasted longer than usual, her small arms around our necks, smelling of sunscreen and pine. Saturday night, we built the promised fire in the stone pit down by the water, marshmallows toasting on sticks. Lily insisted on whittling herself. And as the flames popped and the sky darkened, I felt Tom's arm slide around my shoulders, tentative at first, then firmer when I leaned in. And later, after she was asleep, we stayed by the dying embers, my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady and familiar. And when he kissed the top of my head, it wasn't a demand for more, but an offering, a quiet permission to feel safe and closeness again. And I turned my face up to his, our lips meeting soft and slow, the first real kiss since before the party, tasting of smoke and chocolate and something deeper. Forgiveness emerging, not as a grand declaration, but as a series of small surrenders. Letting him hold me without tensing, letting myself want him without fear that desire meant vulnerability I couldn't afford yet. We didn't rush to the bedroom, we stayed outside until the fire was ash, talking about what came next, maybe supervised family events, if Emily ever proved consistent change, maybe letters instead of calls for a long while, maybe therapy as a permanent part of our rhythm, rather than a crisis response. And when we finally went inside, undressing quietly in the dark, bodies remembering each other with careful reverence, the reconnection felt physical and emotional at once, a reclaiming of intimacy that had been starved by suspicion and silence. Sunday morning, we lingered over coffee on the deck, Lily still sleeping, and Tom took my hand across the small table, thumb tracing circles on my wrist, and said, whatever happened with Emily or my dad or the larger family mess, this, the three of us, here, choosing each other every day, was the center we'd protect. And I believed him, not because the pain was gone, but because we tested the ground together and found it held, scarred but solid. And as we packed to leave, folding blankets and rinsing mugs, I felt the shift settle. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment, but this accumulation of tested closeness, of showing up when it was easier to hide, of letting love look like caution and courage side by side. And driving home with Lily humming in the back, Tom's hand on my knee, the highway stretching ahead under a sky finally clear, I let myself hope. Not wildly, not blindly, but quietly. Realistically, that we were building something stronger than what had broken, something that could weather the next storm, because we'd learned, painfully, how to name it, face it, and choose each other through it. A year to the day after the party, April 12th, 2026. The calendar notification on my phone pinged at 7:14 a.m. while I stood at the kitchen counter, slicing strawberries for Lily's lunch, the same counter where Tom and I had once written those first frantic boundaries on a yellow legal pad. And I paused, knife hovering, because the reminder wasn't one I'd set. It was an old recurring event from before everything cracked, labeled simply my birthday, with a little cake emoji I'd added years ago, when optimism still felt effortless, and seeing it there, unedited, untouched by the revision of last spring, brought a quiet ache that wasn't quite pain anymore, but something softer, more like the tenderness over a healed scar you still feel when the weather changes. Lily bounded in, then, backpack already slung over one shoulder, even though the bus wasn't due for 20 minutes. asking if she could take the leftover pizza slice for lunch instead of the sandwich I was making. And I said yes without the usual negotiation, because today felt different, lighter somehow. The house smelling of fresh coffee and the faint lemon from the cleaner I'd used yesterday. No trace left of that sour aftermath smell that had lingered for weeks. Tom came down the stairs in his work shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair still damp from the shower. And when he saw me standing there with the phone in one hand and the knife in the other, he crossed the room without a word, took the knife gently from my fingers, finished the strawberries, Proskal, and slid the container toward Lily's open lunch bag, then turned to me and asked, low so she wouldn't hear over her humming, "You okay?" And I nodded. Mostly because the year had taught me that okay didn't have to mean perfect or unscarred, just present, breathing, choosing the day in front of me instead of the one behind. We dropped Lily at the bus stop together, something we'd started doing more often since the lake weekend, small rituals that felt like quiet recommitments. And on the walk back, Tom's hand found mine without fanfare, fingers threading naturally, the way they had before suspicion, made every touch feel like a question. And when we reached the driveway, he stopped, pulled me in for a brief hug that smelled of his shampoo and the faint motor oil from the garage project he'd been tinkering with, and murmured against my hair. We made it through another April, not triumphantly, but factually, like noting the passage of seasons, and I pressed my face into his shoulder for a second longer, letting the solidity of him anchor the swirl of memories that always rose this time of year, the ambulances, the smile in the corner, the first tear-soaked night on the couch, the slow climb back through therapy rooms and lake docks and fireside confessions. The rest of the morning passed in ordinary rhythm, work emails answered between sips of coffee, gone lukewarm, a quick call to my dad, who now checked in weekly without mentioning Emily unless I brought her up first. His voice careful, but warmer than it used to be after months of respecting the space we demanded, and by afternoon I found myself scrolling through the phone's photo album. Not the curated ones, but the raw roll of the last 12 months. Lily's science fair project on water pollution. That won third place. Tom's surprise grin when I gave him new guitar strings for Christmas. The three of us at the pumpkin patch in October, with cheeks flushed from cold and laughter. No forced smiles, just the gradual return of ease. Emily appeared in none of them. Not because we'd erased her entirely, but because the contact had stayed minimal, supervised, and distant. A few carefully worded letters she'd sent through her therapist last fall, each one shorter and less defensive than the last. An apology that didn't ask for immediate forgiveness but acknowledged the harm without excuses. And then, 6 months ago, a single supervised coffee meet at a neutral cafe downtown where she'd sat across from Tom and me, hands folded tight in her lap, and said she was still working on herself, and said attending group sessions for anger and resentment patterns, and that she understood if we never wanted more than occasional updates. We'd listened, said little beyond thanks for the honesty, and left without hugs or promises, but the air between us had felt less toxic, more like neutral ground than battlefield. That night, we kept it simple. No big party, no backyard grill that might trigger flashbacks. Just takeout tie on the living room coffee table. Lily sprawled on the rug with her tablet drawing digital cats, while Tom and I sat close on the couch, legs tangled under a throw blanket, plates balanced on our knees. After she went upstairs to read in bed, we stayed there. TV on low with some nature documentary. Neither of us was really watching, and he turned to me, set his plate aside, and said, I was thinking about last year, how I almost lost us by not seeing what was right in front of me, and I shook my head, told him we'd both missed things, that the real loss would have been if we'd stopped trying after the first crack, and he took my hand then, turned it over, traced the faint line of an old burn from cooking too many birthday dinners, and said quietly that he was proud of us, not for pretending nothing happened, but for choosing the harder path of facing it, for going to therapy even when it felt pointless, for protecting Lily without shielding her from the truth that families can break and mend in the same lifetime. I leaned into him, head on his shoulder, and felt the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the warmth of him solid and familiar. And for the first time, the memory of that smile in the corner didn't spike fresh anger, but settled into something quieter, a reminder of how far we'd come, rather than a wound still bleeding. Later, when the house was dark and quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of settling wood, we lay in bed facing each other, hands linked between us on the pillow, and talked in whispers about tomorrow. Lily's spring concert, the new raised garden beds we wanted to build in the backyard, maybe even inviting my dad and stepmom over for a small dinner soon. No, Emily, just the four of us testing what family could look like when boundaries held firm and love wasn't conditional on perfection. We didn't make grand declarations of forever or vow that nothing would ever hurt again. We just held hands in the dark, letting the silence carry the weight of what we'd survived. And when sleep finally pulled me under, it was with a sense of quiet, realistic hope. Not that the scar would vanish, not that trust would ever be blind again, but that we built something stronger in the mending. A bond forged in therapy notes, and lake water, and late night talks. Scarred, yes, but deeper, more honest, more deliberately chosen. And in the morning, when Lily climbed between us, with sleepy demands for pancakes, when Tom kissed my temple before getting up to start the coffee, when the ordinary light of another April day filtered through the blinds, I felt it settle fully that we weren't just enduring, we were living forward together, with eyes open and hearts cautiously, stubbornly open too. And that was enough, more than enough, for whatever came next.